And now,
How's it, everybody? My name is Kelii. I'm an alcoholic. TYG is my home group. And I will be covering from the beginning of the foreword to the second edition. And from where we left off last week, there is a link. If you missed last week, you can catch up, listen to the link, and then continue on each week as we go through the book. My sobriety date is March 29th, 1995, and I got sober in Hawaii. And I'm gonna start reading. I'm so thankful for all the people who got this meeting going. So if you don't have a sponsor, get a sponsor so you can go through the book with your sponsor. And if you are a sponsor, awesome. You can go through the book with your sponsee. Right on. So let's get started. The foreword to the second edition. Figures given in this foreword describe the fellowship as it was in 1955. Since the original foreword to this book was written in 1939, a wholesale miracle has taken place. Our earliest printing voiced the hope that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous at his destination. Already, continues the early text, 2s, 3s, and 5s of us have sprung up in other communities. And from when I first started going through the book, I was told to underline what I thought was an important sentence to me. And I underlined that every alcoholic who journeys will find the fellowship of AA at his destination. And the reason I underlined it is it took me a few years after reading the book a few times to realize that I've found where I needed to be. And that's how it works for us alcoholics. It can take a while before we figure out that this is where we're supposed to be. Okay, I'm going to continue on. 16 years have elapsed between our first printing of this book and the presentation in 1955 of our second edition. In that brief space, Alcoholics Anonymous has mushroomed into nearly 6,000 groups whose membership is far above 150,000 recovered alcoholics. Groups are to be found in each of the United States and all of the provinces of Canada. AA has flourishing communities in the British Isles, the Scandinavian countries, South Africa, South America, Mexico, Alaska, Australia, and Hawaii. I underlined Hawaii because I was so proud that we were mentioned. All told, promised beginnings have been made in some 50 foreign countries and US possessions. Some are just now taking shape in Asia. Many of our friends encourage us by saying that this is but a beginning. Only the augury, and we're gonna stop when I see a word that I really gotta figure out if I know what it is. And I had underlined that word and looked it up, and it means sign of the future. But we have some folks at our meeting that you can go ahead, our co-hosts, Amanda and Jamie. If you're not sure of a word, you can just go ahead and send it through the chat, asking them, or we also have some material that will help. There's lots of words. These are some of them being used in the late 30s and up to the 50s that maybe aren't around much anymore. So only the augury or sign of the future of a much larger future ahead. And as we read through this portion, I'm sure what seeing this explosion through the whole world of Alcoholics Anonymous from it's a wholesale miracle. That's what it is, and it's flourishing. And from there to this point, the numbers are staggering. Okay, let's continue. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. And that is Bill W. and Dr. Bob. And we'll be going through a lot of what happened in that first thing through the book. So I'm not going to go through too much. But that is technically, I guess, our first AA meeting was those two gentlemen. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. And what I'm gonna stop right there and go into a little bit of who that person was. His name was Ebby Thatcher, and he shared with Bill a few things, but one was what he had done to deal with his alcoholism. And I'm going to share on the screen what Bill wrote down. He had developed this way of dealing with his alcoholism and shared it with Bill W. in 1934. Ebby was Bill W.'s sponsor because he was the first guy who helped Bill. And Bill had that experience, that spiritual experience. Number one, Ebby admitted that he was powerless to manage his own life. 2, he became honest with himself as never before and made an examination of conscience. 3, he made a rigorous confession of his personal defects and thus quit living alone with his problems. 4, he surveyed his distorted relations with other people, visiting them to make what amends he could. He resolved to devote himself to helping others in need without the usual demands for personal prestige or material gain. And 6, by meditation, he sought God's direction for his life and the help to practice these principles of conduct at all times. And so when we read, thanks, Sasha, we can go back. As we're reading through this section, we're starting to understand that there's a lot of things that had to happen in order for AA to get rolling. I left off with who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. There's going to be a lot of sections where, and it's been talked about, the Oxford groups were a group that had tried to deal with alcoholism from the from the late 1800s up to that day. And I'm going to cover a little bit of their 6 steps that were kind of used by the early AA members. But next we're gonna go on. He had also been greatly helped. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. He also gave Bill W. a book by a man named William James, who was a psychiatrist. And his book was called The Varieties of Religious Experiences. And starting on the second paragraph, there are a large number of correlations between the AA program and the text of Varieties of Religious Experiences. Perhaps James' most important contribution in this regard was the indirect influence he had on the first 3 of the 12 steps. When reading through Varieties, Bill W. noticed that the experiences which were documented all had similar traits. In particular, he saw that immediately prior to a religious or conversion experience, individuals reported significant reduction in their ego, usually due to some overwhelming burden or difficulty in their life. As a consequence, they became willing to seek help from any potential source, even an unseen but higher power. Bill saw that the admission of defeat, coupled with a willingness to accept outside help from a superior force, could leave an alcoholic open to a life-altering spiritual experience. It is important to note that Varieties was not interested primarily in the study of theology or dogma, but rather in the relationship between individuals and what they considered to be divine. In other words, James sought to analyze each case as a unique individual and did not seek to make their experience fit into an existing creed. Later, AA would adopt the idea of God as we understood him, suggesting that each member was encouraged to use whatever concept of a higher power they found useful. James' flexible definition of religion and spirituality is clearly evident in this development in AA. Okay, so now we're carrying on. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth. And Dr. Silkworth was mentioned in the preface and the prior section that we read. And his impact on AA, we're going to be reading the doctor's opinion, which he authored. He developed the illness concept of alcoholism, which provided medical legitimacy for AA. And he believed alcoholism was poorly understood by the medical community. Their prevailing view was that alcohol use was under the mental control of the patient, and the belief that alcoholism was a vice, not an illness. Dr. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence on God. And from page 263 of the big book, these are those 6 steps. Complete deflation, dependence and guidance from a higher power, moral inventory, confession, restitution, continued work with other alcoholics. I always found it interesting that it was a few years before I learned that there was actually only 6 steps for a long time. And to see that how things had grown from the beginning through up to this point, and then actually till today, is amazing. I know a higher power is in charge. Prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic. But he had succeeded only in keeping sober himself. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. he suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. This physician, Dr. Bob, had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. So when I first was struggling with alcohol, I went to church a lot, and I prayed and I swore with all my heart for God to help me and that I didn't want to be an alcoholic. But there was a piece of the puzzle missing, and it was the fellowship of AA that opened up the door for me to realize that I couldn't just count on God without me understanding a lot of different things that we're going to work on as we go through the book. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Hence, the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. There, their very first case, a desperate run, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. I just wanted to add the amazing archives that AA has. And through all this time, people are studying exactly who all these people are in the big book. And if you're interested, you can find out. And so AA number 3 was a gentleman named Bill Dotson. He's famous for being the man on the bed in a lot of pictures we see. And they actually know his sobriety date. It's June 26, 1935. We'll carry on. He never had another drink. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. Okay. Do any of my co-hosts want to jump in and add anything? Okay, we're going to carry on. I was listening to a conference one time, and the speaker was from New York, and he kept sharing that, okay, they started in Ohio, but it took a guy from New York to get it started. I thought it was funny. Okay, a second small group promptly took shape at New York, to be followed in 1937 with the start of a third at Cleveland. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or in New York who were trying to form groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. It was now time, the struggling groups thought, to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The flying blind period ended, and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time. It took me many years to understand and be so grateful for those who came before us and how difficult it was during the flying blind period. Like I said, there's these wonderful letters from these different areas writing to New York to ask questions and to describe their difficulties. And so it applies to us now. There's always going to be difficult times. And if they could get through it, we can. Okay, with the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Ausler, then editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics and God. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries. 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers. New groups started up, and it was found, to the astonishment of everyone, that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends to which he invited AA members to tell their stories. News of this got on the world wires. Inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstores to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. By March 1941, the membership had shot up to 2,000. Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post and placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public that alcoholics in need of help really deluged us. By the close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. The mushrooming process was in full swing. AA had become a national institution. A lot of AA historians consider the Jack Alexander article in the Saturday Evening Post one of the big things that really gave AA a rocket boost. Couple of the issues was Jack Alexander wasn't a puff piece writer. He was an investigative writer that was usually trying to write stories to discredit things. And that was his goal, was to discredit Alcoholics Anonymous. But the more he interviewed, the more some of his notes on what he found out was that he was mystified. Why would people be helping people for nothing? Where was the leadership? Who was in charge? Why were they so successful? And the more he investigated, the more he became pretty sure that Alcoholics Anonymous was the real thing. Our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period. The test that it faced was this: could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would split AA apart? Soon AA was beset by these very problems on every side and in every group. But out of this frightening and at first disrupting experience, the conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, so we had to evolve principles by which the AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but never govern, that each group was to be autonomous and there was to be no professional class of therapy. There were to be no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own voluntary contributions. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relations were to be based on attraction rather than promotion. It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films. And in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversies. This was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 561 of this book. Though none of these principles had the force of rules or laws, they had become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed by our first international conference held at Cleveland. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets that our society has. I just wanted to share a short story that I was told during this time that in the South, as they were trying to get AA meetings going, there was segregation. And they would write to New York, and Bill W. answered a letter, and he told them, he would ask them, well, what are the rules? And he would be told, oh, we have to be in separate areas. And his answer was, well, put up a partition so everybody can hear each other, and it's like you're in the same meeting. And that's like a miracle to me that long ago, our fellowship was really into what our primary purpose is. And that's to help the alcoholic who's still suffering. Okay, I'm going to stop there because that's a great place for someone else to take over for me. And I wanted to say thank you for listening to me. And I'm going to pass it to our secretary.
Wow, thank you so much, Kelii. That was so wonderful.